Hey, this is Zen Zenith just sneaking in to say check out the House Show with Zen Zenith. That's me on Dragon Wagon Radio. The House Show is a live concert series featuring stripped-down performances and interviews with amazing singer-songwriters. We do the whole thing in front of a real live audience at a real live house and package the whole thing up into a podcast for you to experience in the ease of your home or car. Real intimate performances, real intimate conversations with great people. Check it out at thehouseshowshow.com or on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever else good podcasts are found. We'll see you there.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers. We're so glad that you could join us for another exciting episode of your favorite podcast. I want to excitedly announce this episode because it has one of my favorite guests returning, and I know that she's a favorite of yours as well because several of you have written to me to say so. We're so thrilled to have Bonner Miller Cutting back on the program for this episode. And we're going to talk about some very exciting new stuff, some stuff that Bonner claims was so salacious it made her mother not ever want to speak of it again. We'll get into that in a minute. You all, those of you who don't know Bonner, she is a second-generation Oxfordian and the author of Necessary Mischief. If you haven't picked up a copy, you can do that, and you can get it wherever you buy your books, especially through Amazon. And she's been on the program a couple of different times, talk about various different things. She is, in my opinion, the most preeminent expert on Renaissance wills. And if you haven't listened to the episode we did together about the will of the Stratford man, that is one of the best episodes we have out there. We'd like to welcome Bonner to this, our 67th episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Bonner, welcome back.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. And it is such a privilege and a pleasure to be doing another interview with you. I wanted to say that I've been on quite a journey with this material. As you said, I had run it by my mother, who was a very eminent Oxfordian scholar, very knowledgeable. I was living with her in her last illness and taking care of her, and she wasn't feeling very well. But I ran this material by her. And I don't know that it was salacious, but I never could figure out what the problem was. But it didn't rest well with her, and she wouldn't discuss it with me. So it's one reason why she died in 2005, and here we are in 2021, and I'm finally going to go public with this work that I was basically starting on all those years ago, and I put it on the back burner. And now I so appreciate this opportunity that you're giving me to talk about it.
Well, we're honored that we get to be the premier location of this brand new material from you. So that's fantastic. We can kind of set it up for the listener a little bit by pointing out that what we're about to talk about is the epic poem Venus and Adonis. And as you have pointed out in conversations with me before, you can't underestimate the importance of this publication. And there are so many Shakespeare files out there who know and love the plays quite well and have maybe even dabbled in some of the sonnets. But oftentimes these epic poems of the writer can get overlooked or even forgotten by folk. And that would be a terrible disservice to the writer and to the entire canon as a whole to ignore the fact that this is the first Shakespeare publication.
Absolutely, and that gives it a very unique place in the works of Shakespeare. Also, that it was the first publication that had Shakespeare's name on it, but the name was not on the title page. Many people don't understand that. This Venus and Adonis is published. It's going to be an absolute sensational success, according to scholars, and it's going to be immensely popular in its time. How amazing it's been kind of forgotten about and on the back shelf now after all these decades or centuries. But at the time, it was first published in 1593, again, with no author's name on the title page, but there was a dedication. And the name William Shakespeare appears on this dedication to a young man whose name is Henry, and he is the Earl of Southampton. And for this purposes of this interview, I'm going to call him Southampton by his title. And this amazing poem has this actually exuberant adulation in this dedication to Southampton. Then, a year later, Shakespeare, whoever he is, follows up Venus and Adonis, this long, extended, narrative, epic poem, as you said, with another long, epic poem called Lucrece, an even longer poem, published the very next year. Again, no name on the title page, but again, a tremendously impressive dedication to Southampton. In fact, this second dedication of the second poem, I call it the follow-up poem, is so effusive with adoration of Shakespeare to Southampton that the great scholars say there's no dedication like this that is so basically gushy and over the top.
Now, I know that you talked about how popular Venus and Adonis was, and I know that The Rape of Lucrece was also extremely popular when it was first published. And they all went through, both of those poems went through multiple publications. I believe Venus and Adonis was like 9 times.
Yes.
I don't think Lucrece was quite as many, but the question I have for you is, in these early publications, because I don't have a copy in front of me to look at or images to look at, but I'm certain you would know, is the name Shakespeare hyphenated in these instances?
No, definitely not in Venus and Adonis. And again, it's not on the title page, but it is signed as the dedication to Southampton. Off the top of my head, I don't think it was in Lucrece dedication, but I'm not sure. I haven't viewed it lately. I will try to get a facsimile of the original and do that. But the incredible popularity of Venus and Adonis, it was published 9 times in less than a decade. If something was republished once, most things were only published one time in early modern England. So if something was republished, it was a success. If it was published again a third time, it was a bestseller. It was a hit. Venus and Adonis is 9 times in less than a decade, and Lucrece is 6 times in a reasonable period of time. That's a total of 15 times within the lifetime of the Stratford man that these 2 fabulous poems are out and about in the marketplace, being bought like crazy, selling like hotcakes. This is an amazing story, just that they were so phenomenally well accepted by the public.
And so here's this, if we're going to believe the traditional narrative, here's this brand new, no-name country poet who comes out with these top hits, back-to-back hit records, as it were, that are flying off the printing press with these flowery, gushing, beautiful dedications to this fairly new titled nobleman. I mean, the third Earl of Southampton certainly does not equate to the 17th Earl of Oxford, for instance. And all these people are reading not only these poems, but also, I would assume they're also reading this dedication these dedications that have now seen print 15 total combined times. And what was the reaction to that? What's even the explanation for that?
Good question. And what's really interesting about it is the reaction after all these centuries is that the great scholars of Shakespeare experts believe that, so they will tell you that Southampton is Shakespeare's beloved Southampton, and Shakespeare is Southampton's beloved Shakespeare. Well, there's a problem here. And the problem is that these 2 men never met. Their paths never crossed in the entirety of their lifetimes. Now, if Southampton, who was only a young boy at the time, he's 19 years old with Venus and Adonis published, and 20 the next year with Lucrece published. Now, if he had just happened to die, he wouldn't have had time to realize how important these two poems were going to be. He wouldn't have time to know that they were going to fly off the press, as you put it so perfectly. He wouldn't have realized that, and he'd have died, so he didn't have time to recognize Shakespeare. But in fact, from the time of the Venus dedication, he and Mr. Stratford, I'm going to call him Stratford Shakespeare, Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford, were going to live for 23 years. They were going to be around and about London, here and there, and they never met. There's not the slightest speck of evidence that their paths ever crossed. Then,
you mean there's not a letter from Southampton that was written to Shakespeare of Stratford saying, "Hey, thank you for the beautiful words. I'm very impressed by your eloquent writing, and I appreciate the fact that this has gone so far as to raise me up in the nobility and bring attention to me as I'm coming into my own as a man of the court."
What you've just said is absolutely right. There is nothing like that, and it's mind-boggling that there is nothing like that. Because when Shakespeare dies, Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford, I should call him Shakespeare of Stratford, in 23 years, the man from Southampton does absolutely nothing to recognize the death or with a tribute of this man who immortalized him. He made him an important person with these two dedications. And then Mr. Southampton lives 8 more years. We've got a total of over 3 decades. And in those remaining 8 years, Southampton never once mentions Shakespeare, Mr. Shakespeare of Stratford. When it's clear.
Well, maybe that was because the writer who wrote these 2 poems and dedicated them so effusively to Southampton also wrote a bunch of other flowery dedications to a bunch of other people throughout his life, and it wasn't really that special.
It's good of you to say that and give me the opportunity to point out that, in fact, these dedications to Southampton are the only dedications that Shakespeare, whoever he was, the only times that he dedicated anything to anyone are these 2 dedications to Southampton. And this was the beginning of his career because, as you supposedly this person from Stratford, because he is going to, at this point, take off, if the story were true, if the official story were true, traditional story that we're taught, he's going to have this fabulous career in the theater. He's going to be writing fabulous masterpieces for the theater, and yet he never dedicates anything to anyone else ever again.
So maybe the problem is not enough people have looked into this deep enough to try to find this scrap of evidence that might exist out there of the connection between these 2 guys.
It's funny that you should say that because, in fact, the what we call the scholars, the historians, the professors of Shakespeare have actually gone stark raving crazy trying to find the connection. One person in particular I want to talk about is a woman whose name was Charlotte Stopes. She's known to history as the indefatigable Mrs. Stopes. Sort of always think of the unsinkable Molly Brown. Well, this is.
I was going to say they made a Broadway musical about that.
Yeah. Well, they need to make a Broadway musical about the indefatigable Mrs. Stopes because she went to the Public Record Office and she was one of the greatest of the scholars that's ever been. She was operational in the early part of the 20th century, where she closeted herself in the Public Record Office for 7 years and read through conservatively 1 million documents, looking precisely for this connection that she was sure had to exist between her beloved Southampton and his beloved Shakespeare. And she came up with absolutely nothing. Nothing to show for 7 years of that kind of laborious work. It was a Herculean effort, and other people have gone to similar efforts, and they can't find a single thing to link the man from Stratford to Southampton to account for these 2 amazing dedications of these major works.
So there we have, yet again, another major element of this greatest literary mystery of all time. And one of the things I love about this topic, and I think one of the reasons why our listeners love this podcast and this topic is because of these deeply mysterious aspects of this.
Oh, I think you're totally right. It is. It's a wonderful mystery. And one thing has a funny way of leading to another. So where we're going to next is, okay, we realize they can't find a connection between the man from Stratford and Southampton. But does a connection exist between our guy, who, because we're an Oxfordian, we believe that the case supporting Edward de Vere's Shakespeare is a very good case. So is there a connection between Southampton and our guy, Oxford? Well, you don't have to spend 7 years in the Public Record Office and read through 1 million documents to find this connection. The connection is that Southampton was going to marry Edward de Vere's daughter, Elizabeth Vere. He would have been, had this marriage stayed on track, he would have been Edward de Vere's son-in-law. Now, that's a heck of a connection. You can't get a closer connection. He would have been a member of Oxford's family. Many people believe that the reason, if Oxford Shakespeare, if one can accept that we're putting forth here, that the reason Oxford made these two remarkable dedications to Southampton was to show that he approved of the match between Southampton and his daughter. And when you're viewing it from 30,000 feet, that makes sense. You'll read that from time to time. That seems to be what a lot of people think. But what I'm here to propose to you today in the vehicle of this interview with the quills that I so appreciate that you're doing, I'm going to propose that is not exactly what was happening here, and not exactly at all what's underpinning these two marvelous, amazing, and adoring dedications of Oxford to Southampton. So may I now launch my thoughts on this?
Absolutely, because, I think most of our listeners have been around this topic enough now. And what I find is new listeners tend to discover the podcast by the latest episode, and then they go back and start listening to older episodes, sometimes off of topics that they're most interested in, or sometimes because it's the same guest and they want to hear everything from that guest that's been recorded. But most often what they do is they go back to the beginning and start at episode 1 and start working their way through, sort of like binge watching Game of Thrones on television. And so I think many, many, many of the listeners are very familiar with who Southampton is, and the fact that he, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, many people, is the linchpin to this mystery in so many ways. And everybody has different theories as to what the relationship between Oxford and Southampton truly was. And what you're about to shed some light on, I think, is that relationship, but perhaps a different spin on it than we've heard before. Was that where we're going?
That's exactly where we're going. Yes. I want to clarify something. I believe I said it was an engagement, or we would look at it now as an engagement between Southampton and Oxford's daughter. Back then, they called it a project of marriage, And
I like that. That's a much better term, because marriage is a project. I'm here to tell you.
Very good, yes. And this project of marriage was put on the table not by Oxford himself, not by the potential bride's father. It was put on the table by her grandfather, who was none other than William Cecil Lord Burleigh. And I'm going to try to remember to pronounce his name William Cecil Lord Burleigh, because that's how it's correctly pronounced. But just to be sure that we're clear on this person, and I'll try to remember to call him Lord Burleigh. But
I've always noted that about you, that is one of your things, that you do commonly call him Cecil. That's one of your Bonnerisms is that you call him William Cecil.
Well, I'll try to control that and pronounce it correctly, because the correct pronunciation is Cecil. However, but it's very, very important to understand that, of course, people who are into this and listening to this know that Oxford had the privilege of marrying William Cecil's daughter, Anne Cecil. Yes. And when Anne Cecil died in 1588, and I'm sorry to throw out dates because dates bore people, but she had died in 1588, and at that point, William Cecil, her father, They had 5 children altogether, 3 surviving daughters. One of their daughters and the only son died young. So the 3 surviving daughters were taken into custody by William Cecil, her father, who basically seized custody of these 3 daughters. Now, you can bet that did not make Oxford very happy. But he lost, when he lost custody of his 3 daughters, he lost something that was very, very important to him. He lost control of their marriage. He lost the patriarchal prerogative to be able to make the daughter's marriage, to put it out to put forth the project of marriage for his daughters, which would direct the future of his family and his progeny and his dynasty, which is something they took very much to heart back then. So, but why pick Southampton to engage for the project of marriage, for this sort of engagement, for the project with Southampton? Why did William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, pick Southampton? Well, Southampton was also his ward. Southampton's father had died, leaving Southampton a minor. And according to the wardship situation, the social system called wardship, William Cecil, who was in charge of the whole wardship of everybody's wardship, he took the most important wards, because Southampton was now an earl, he took the most important wards into his own home for him to raise them and educate them. So he now has, and control their marriage, by the way. He is their guardian. So he's the guardian of his granddaughters, he controls, and this is the oldest granddaughter. She's now of age to arrange her marriage. She is at this point in time, she is 14. And
oh, yes, the ripe old age of 14. That old maid, she's about to become an old maid if they don't get this done right away.
Exactly. And Southampton is 16. So he has 2 teenagers who are actually, we would think this is rather much, but these are the appropriate age for him to be arranging their marriage. There is that they will marry each other. It made sense. He could control them both, and so he puts this forth as the project of marriage. There's only one problem. This is a serious problem. Southampton refused the marriage. The marriage was put forth in 1589, and Southampton refused the marriage, and he rejected it. Now, we have this on very good authority in the biographies of Southampton by the indefatigable Mrs. Stopes' biography and later biographers. They know that Southampton rejected Elizabeth Vere for his potential wife, which means, okay, what's going on now if Elizabeth Vere's father is going to honor him 4 years later? Which is another thing. It's becoming a very bad situation. It became a very bad situation with this rejection. And the rejection is one thing if it just happened and everybody got over it. But this rejection is going to last with this situation for 4 years. Once again, dates can be boring to people, but from 1589 to the time Venus and Adonis is going to be published in 1593, we have 4 years with Southampton's stout refusal to marry and go forth with a marriage prospect and plans with Elizabeth Vere. What happened in these 4 years is Southampton earned the wrath of William Cecil Lord Burleigh, because this is horrible. Is this imaginable? Because he has had the temerity to reject Lord Burleigh's granddaughter for his prospective bride. We know that there was wrath going out at him. Most people knew how powerful William Cecil was, and nobody with their right mind wanted to be on William Cecil's bad side. But now he was
definitely the most powerful man in Elizabethan England. There was no king, but he was the closest. He was the closest thing to a king, and he certainly was the queen's queen maker, because
Absolutely.
If it hadn't been for him, I argue, she would not have reigned as long as she did.
I think you're totally right, and many historians will support exactly what you said, that she may not have ever become queen because he paved the way when she was in grave danger when she was a princess. He paved the way to keep her alive and get her in a position to become queen if the circumstances worked out. He was with her at her shoulder for 40 years of her reign, that she would probably not have become queen, and if she did, she would not have been reigned as long and successfully as she did. And it is because of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh.
Absolutely.
One of his greatest hits, and I use that word knowing what I'm saying, and people may not realize this. He was responsible. We say he was powerful and he did all this stuff to make Elizabeth queen. Yes, he single-handedly brought about the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. It took him 15 years of plotting and scheming and manipulating to get the political situation right and to get her to the block in 1587. So what you're looking at is 2 years later, he puts this project of marriage on the table for Southampton, and Southampton has the effrontery to say no. I mean, this man has taken out a queen. It's not real smart not to go along with what he wants him to do, but as strange as it seems, this is exactly the position that Southampton took. And now William Cecil is going to punish him. We have documentation that we don't know if Cecil actually mismanaged the Southampton properties or if he just threatened to. But he did. He definitely threatened to let Southampton's properties go to rack and ruin so that when he would come of age, he would not have the money to do what an earl would want to do. The second thing he did, and this is even worse, William Cecil had a personal secretary, and it was the personal secretary who worked on his wardship matters. The man's name was John Clapham. And so William Cecil clearly allowed this to happen. He let Clapham publish, which means it's in the public domain, publish this very ugly pamphlet, a poem called Narcissus, where it was clear that Clapham was accusing Southampton of being narcissistic and full of self-love, and that's why he wouldn't go forward with a marriage to marry Burleigh's granddaughter, Elizabeth Vere.
Oh my God, God forbid a 16-year-old boy who is a little egotistical and stands up to authority. Go figure.
Right. Exactly. Well, this was published in 1591, and dates really kind of matter because we've got a timeline on this. But William Cecil, allowed his own secretary, so he's clearly finding this to be with his wishes, to publicly humiliate and publicly shame Southampton for rejecting this marriage. In fact, it's amazing that Southampton, when he came of age, when he becomes 21, which is going to happen 3 years later in 1594, it's amazing that Southampton didn't grab a sword and go challenge the secretary to a duel and try to kill him, because they fought the honor. What's happened to Southampton is he has now been officially, in a very public way, dishonored and humiliated. He can't be a happy camper.
Did he ever give a reason? Do we have any documentation that Southampton wrote a letter to anyone or put anything down anywhere that he gave a reason why he did not want to marry Elizabeth Vere?
There's some interesting letters that are published in Charlotte Stope's book and some later books, but they're kind of ambiguous. They kind of his mother tried to say, well, he just doesn't want to get married at all right now, and they're kind of wishy-washy because the mother and the grandfather of Southampton knew that they were on very perilous territory if they thwarted what William Cecil wanted to have done. And so they're kind of, if anybody wants to go to the trouble to get these biographies and read what they have to say, these letters are there, but they're kind of, they don't really give a specific reason. But the suspicion is the only reason that a ward could refuse a marriage put before him by his guardian, in this case his guardian is William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, is if he believed that there was some disparagement. The important word is disparagement involved in the marriage. And there were only two things that could cause disparagement. This was the only two grounds he had. And we have no clue that he really thought this. One disparagement would be if she were beneath him in rank. And because she's the daughter of an earl and he's an earl, that's perfect. She's not beneath him in rank. Secondly, he could refuse the marriage if there was something physically or mentally wrong with her, if she had a physical or mental defect or disability. and we don't know of any. And he never officially claimed disparagement, but at this point, the specter of disparagement, that something's wrong with Elizabeth Vere, is hanging over her because he's refused the marriage. So
okay, so I don't want to drag you into the weeds, but some of my listeners I think will know where I'm going with this, and others who don't, I promise will come back to the path in a moment. But could the disparagement have been the cloud that hung over Elizabeth de Vere and her parentage? I mean, we do know that her father, for the first 5 years of her life, refused to acknowledge her as his true daughter. Could that have been a reason that there was this cloud of bastardy that still lingered there?
I don't think so. You could make that point, but I really don't think so, because once he had reconciled. That's true. Because it's going to be important in just a few moments what I really think about this. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that Oxford had decided when he reconciled with Anne Cecil and they had 4 more children, that he had pretty clearly decided to accept Elizabeth Vere as his child, and that cloud from those early 5 years, which was a horrible thing for the Cecil family, and was pretty much abated by that time and ameliorated. And if it wasn't, it's about going to be. Okay? I've got a nice thing to share with you. Something in this point, though, what we have here is a situation, as we call it today, that has festered for nearly 4 years. And something has happened, though. At some point, we don't know exactly, and I've looked to try to nail down these dates and get a better time frame on it. But it happened sometime in 1592 or early 1593. Elizabeth Vere met someone, and she fell in love with someone she really wanted to marry. And this person's name was William Stanley. And William Stanley was the younger son of the Earl of Derby. Now, this is what brought this terrible stalemate and impasse with Southampton not wanting to go forward with the marriage. This is what brought everything to taking on putting a new light on all of this thing. William Cecil Lord Burleigh, it changes the calculus in his mind, because if his granddaughter can marry the Earl of Derby, she will become the Countess of Derby. And being the Countess of Derby was way more prestigious than being the Countess of Southampton. Basically, what appeared on the horizon was a better match. And that is what I think pretty clearly is what appealed to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and why he was willing to change his mind and start to work through the issues and let Southampton off the hook, so to speak. However, he had the idea that somewhere on this horizon, his daughter would marry into the Derby family. And by the way, the Derbys it was the richest of the earldoms, and they carried the blood royal in their veins. William Stanley's great-grandmother was Mary Tudor, who was a younger sister of King Henry VIII. So to marry this marriage was really significant. This would be something that William Cecil would be really interested in promoting. The deal is he's now has Southampton in a fix. Southampton has been dishonored. He's been publicly disgraced. And it's had some effect to dishonor and disrespect his own granddaughter, who needs her title cleared so that she can make a better match. The specter of dishonor and disrespect and disgrace is hanging over both of these young people. So what are they going to do about it? I'm going to propose that what they're going to do about it is they're going to find someone who can write a poem based on a story from Ovid. Remember, the earlier poem that disgraced Southampton, Narcissus, is from a story from Ovid. But what they need is a better poem based on a story from Ovid that the general public is going to just love. And they will this poem will be dedicated to Southampton, and it will give him back all of the honor that was ripped from him by the really ugly dedication to him. They're now going to restore his honor. Believe it or not. Can honor be that important? You would wonder, this is all about honor. Is that a silly thing for us to think this could be all about? Well, Oxford this is a gambit. Actually, it's a lot to ask of a poem and a dedication. But Oxford can do it. And Oxford is the only one who can do it because, first of all, Oxford is the father of the intended bride. So he can give the honor back to Southampton that Southampton has forfeited in rejecting his daughter because he's her father. And he's saying, it's okay with me. And he can say that because he wasn't involved in the initial project of marriage. William Cecil is the one that made this mess. He had nothing to do with putting this project of marriage on the table that has gone so badly for all these years. Oxford, as I wrote here in my notes here, Oxford was not responsible for this particular mess. Also, we propose that Oxford is the one person in all of England who can put words on paper and write a poem that is so good that the entirety of educated people in England will notice it and be impressed by it. And by the way, this is what's going to happen. Now, if I were giving a talk at a conference, I would have a PowerPoint right here by me. And on that PowerPoint would be this dedication, this fabulous dedication to Southampton that is signed by William Shakespeare. And I would ask the audience, it'd be there nice and big, and people could read it easily. And I would say, okay, audience, now I know people listening to this, some of them may have read the dedication, many of them probably have not. And I hope they'll be curious enough to do it because this dedication, every word is screaming with importance. But I would ask them, okay, is there one word in particular that jumps out at you because you see it in this dedication over and over again? And the word is honor. Over and over in this short paragraph, he dedicates it to the Right Honourable Henry. He addresses him as Right Honourable. He says, only if your honours seem but pleased, I vow to take advantage of all idle hours until I have honoured you. He's talking about honoring him. I leave it to your honourable survey, he writes. Whoever Shakespeare is, he's writing this. And your honour to your heart's content. And this is several things in this that are amazing, but the way it closes, I leave your honor to your heart's content, which I wish will always answer your own wish. Isn't that amazing? He's telling him, as far as I'm concerned, you can go off and marry whoever you want to. Your heart's content.
And the world's hopeful expectation.
Yes, and you are now going to have your honor restored, your reputation restored, and you can be the great patron of the arts and have a great career as an earl, which actually, well, he has some issues in his life to be, but he is going to be a very interesting person.
And however, Edward ends up getting a great son-in-law in the Earl of Derby's son.
It's
right?
actually it's all
his
going
daughter gets to marry the man she loves. She gets to be a Juliet without drinking the poison.
she gets her heart's content too. Exactly.
Yes.
It's really an amazing thing. And this whole situation is going to have an extremely amazing and unusual anomaly attached to it. Something very startling is attached to the publication of Venus and Adonis. When it was registered for publication on April 18th of 1593, it was authorized for publication by none other than the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, if Archbishop of Canterbury authorized for publication stuff all over the place, that'd be different. But he only authorized religious tracts. I read somewhere he authorized one other secular tract piece, and I can't find it, but I will look further. But for all practical purposes, he only authorized religious publications, things like sermons and religious translations and theology pieces, things that he believed that were of religious value to his flock who went to church. This particular poem, Venus and Adonis, is a genre known as mythical erotica. In fact, by the by the standards of the time, this thing is well-nigh pornographic literature. This is well-nigh
pretty
pornography.
racy.
What is he doing?
It's a racy poem, and in the poem you see that Venus is like the Elizabethan equivalent of a cougar in her seduction of the young Adonis, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, you put it in a very interesting way, but yes, you're absolutely right. And Adonis is trying to fend off him. Her advances. Adonis is placed in a very moral, upright status, but with Venus coming on to him pretty sensuously, and it's really a very amazing poem.
It's incredible that he can actually refuse the goddess of love, that he has the strength, the willpower to actually put his foot down and refuse her advances.
Yes. And maybe because that's one of the reasons why Oxford, who had two poems on his drawing board, he has this poem and he had Lucrece, why he thought to put forth the first poem to be Venus and Adonis, because he thought it was such, as you put it, racy stuff, that it would sell. And sure enough, it did. It sold. It just was, as they've all said, it was a sensational success. But mostly the Orthodox scholars who write about Venus and Adonis, either they barely mention that this thing is authorized, licensed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and why on earth was he stepping up to the plate to do this when he generally did not do anything remotely secular? One of the historians of Southampton who actually wrote about this has these words to say: about the Archbishop's license, we have lost a good story.
I'll say.
Yeah, well, yeah.
That's an understatement.
Is that ever? Because I actually think that it was the Archbishop of Canterbury, because look at the principles in this thing. You've got William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. You've got his ward, who was to be an earl. You've got Elizabeth Vere. You've got Oxford. And you've got a printer who could say, one time William Cecil, the great Lord Burleigh, might change his mind again and might not really want this to be published, dedicated to Southampton. He might decide he's mad at Southampton again, and he might decide to lop off my hand like he did about a decade earlier. He'd lopped off the hand of a publisher and a writer who published something he did not like. So he said, I really need to be sure that I'm safe when I print and publish this thing. Well, when the Archbishop of Canterbury licensed it, that is the best authority and the safest authority and the most secure authority that you can have to say, yes, you can go ahead and print this and publish it. Quite an amazing thing.
So I love the fact that I absolutely agree with you that the publication of these two poems are meant to be a major message, and that the dedications to Southampton are not a coincidence and serve an immense purpose. I hadn't looked at it this way, with the part of having to restore the honor based on the disparagement, and I'll use that term, that Burleigh reflected back on Southampton through Clapham's publication of Narcissus. I hadn't considered that aspect of it. And I hadn't considered the aspect of how Edward played a role in this sort of marriage triangle that occurred. But it does appear to me that in the long run, it was the best for Elizabeth. She marries the love of her life. By all accounts, they have a good marriage, and they're very happy together. She has what is probably a much less volatile husband, because we know the Earl of Southampton was so rash and headstrong, proven by his willingness to thwart Burleigh's intentions at the age of 16. So I think in the long run, the truest winner is her.
It's a win-win thing. Everybody involved in this sordid mess actually turns out to be a winner. As you put it, there's no question that the greatest winners of all are the two young people. Southampton and Elizabeth Vere go their separate ways, and they now have a clean slate with their honor restored and the cloud of disparagement removed from Elizabeth Vere and Southampton's honor restored, so they can marry according to their own wishes, which is what they both actually do. Secondly, William Cecil Lord Burleigh, he gets the most prestigious earldom in the land for his own granddaughter. She will become the Countess of Derby, as you said, which is really quite a coup for the Cecil family. But what does Oxford get out of it? Actually, he's a pretty big winner, too, from this. First of all, in this transaction, he's going to get to direct to make it possible for his daughter to marry, according to her wishes, the Earl of Derby. So he will get to have some say in the future of his family, which was his patriarchal prerogative that he was robbed of when William Cecil swooped down on him and took custody of his daughters. And all this time, the daughter, initially he had refused to acknowledge Elizabeth as his, but then you can imagine growing up, and by the time Elizabeth is now in William Cecil's household, she's never heard one good word about her father. She has probably thought her father is a real bad person. And here, he's the one stepping up to the plate to make things right for her to have her heart's content. He is reinvigorated, restored, rejuvenated, rehabilitated might be the best word for it. He has rehabilitated himself in the eyes of his daughter. And actually, once she marries the Earl of Derby, they're going to be visiting quite a bit. And that's going to very possibly be a very important thing, I think, in his life. And that's something I'm going to show when I write this up later. That, yes, this actually put him back as the patriarch of his family. He has facilitated the process to enable her to marry the man she loves. And now she has a very good prospect for the rest of her life. But the one thing that he gets too...
This is a theme later on in his life as well, because later on, Bridget's the youngest, yes?
No, Susan's youngest.
Elizabeth, Bridget, Susan.
Susan's
the youngest.
Yes.
Right. So later on in life, he ends up allowing Susan to marry the man that she wants to marry. And that all goes ugly, real fast. But he gives in and he lets her choose, and she has a terrible nose for men because she chooses a complete loser.
Actually, I think you're thinking of Bridget. Actually, Robert Cecil is the person who put that on the that project of marriage on the table, and it did not go well for poor Bridget. And
so it is Bridget I'm thinking of, but she's the middle daughter.
You're the middle daughter, and she just had a terrible marriage and marriage life, and that's another story. But Oxford had actually been asked by Robert Cecil if he would approve her marriage. The first marriage on the table, the first project, was to the Earl of Pembroke, and the letter that's existing says that he gave that approval to Pembroke. But then this is a story on that. Cecil doesn't let her get married to Pembroke. He marries her to this real scoundrel, and she has a very bad time of it. But let's get back for a second to Elizabeth Vere and this situation of the publication of Venus and Adonis, which is going to make everybody, it's almost like a reversing entropy. It's going to make everything right for these young people, and it's going to make everything right for Oxford. But one of the things Oxford's going to get out of it is something that he never thought as a nobleman that he would ever live to see. Now, we know he'd been writing. He'd written poems, and he'd had a few poems published. But now he was going to see a big major work in print, and in a manner in which he could be proud. And now a really amazing thing. We know that it was licensed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. That should make somebody proud. But what there should be is understood about Venus and Adonis. Everybody knows it's a masterpiece of literature. That's well known. What is also recognized is that Venus and Adonis is a masterpiece of typesetting. This is quite a remarkable thing. And the Shakespearean experts, when they write about it, they propose that their guy, Mr. Shaxper Stratford, went to the printing house every day to proofread it and supervise it through the printing process. That is what they write. I've read that in a number of places. I'm sure you have too. That that their person with no experience, with nothing previously published, is going to the printing house to get this published. Well, every day. Well, never mind that the person who's going to the printing house to supervise the printing every day has forgotten to put his name on the title page. Aw, shucks. But he's going to supervise it. Okay. That was my irony of this thing. But still, I do believe that the great professors are right about one thing. I believe that somebody went every day to the printer's house, to the printing shop, to proofread it and supervise getting it into print, which is why it is practically perfect. It is an amazing piece of publication. It's an amazing publication, not just an amazing work of art. And with this in mind, who might have done this? Who would have the sort of qualifications to shepherd a very important work through the press? And it's important because it's been authorized by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So people are taking it pretty seriously, right? So the person who's doing this, now Oxford didn't do it. I'm not putting that forth. But Oxford had been surrounded his whole adult life by scholars who'd written books and poems and published translations and published all kinds of things and had experience with the publication process of their works. One person really stands out as being the person who would be perfect with the right qualifications to go to Richard Field's printing house and supervise the printing of Venus and Adonis. This person was the most accomplished translator in England, and it's this person who did the translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses that Venus and Adonis is based on. It's his work. This is basically the progeny that comes from his own work.
Sure.
This wonderful extension of Venus and Adonis in the translation is now moved into this fabulous narrative poem. So who is the person who might have done this?
Edward's Uncle Arthur.
Uncle Arthur? He contacted Uncle Arthur. Well, was Uncle Arthur around? That's one of the things I've spent some time in the past and some time recently going back over again is, where was Uncle Arthur? Was he available to do this? It's his it's his story of Venus and Adonis and his translation that's used as a source for this poem. But
by this point, how old is Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid by this point? 10 years, 20 years?
It was published. It's Shakespeare, namely Oxford, or Oxford as we think, utilized 3 books from Golding because there were 15 books altogether. Golding's was a massive translator. The works that he translated will go on, and then they were republished and reprinted. The Golding translation of the 15 books of Ovid were published 8 times, went through 8 reprintings. It was almost as popular as Venus and Adonis, although the time frame they were going through being published was much, much longer. Another thing, let me reiterate that one of the things that makes Venus and Adonis such as they call it, sensational success is these 9 times were published in less than a decade. I don't think there's anything out there that flew off the shelves of the printing presses like Venus and Adonis. And Arthur Golding had published he initially published the Venus and Adonis story, I think, in 1567. And at this point, he was living in William Cecil's house with his nephew, Edward de Vere.
Right.
And supervising Edward de Vere's education. So, golly, he'd be the perfect person to supervise the printing of this poem, this massive poem. But where was he living? Was he still living? Yes, he was still living, and he was at this point getting into his 50s, maybe his late 50s. So he's getting on in years, but he's still active. And what's amazing is that, and this would sound bad at first, but the more I studied it, the more wonderful it gets. At this time frame, 1592 to 1593, Arthur Golding had been referred to the Fleet prison for debt. Oh my God. Are you there?
Was he a poor man? He was poor after all that work and all of those commissions and printing and publishing all that stuff. He went broke?
Actually, he had a lot of difficulties with debt, and this wasn't unusual. He had inherited a lot of properties. Actually, the family was quite well off, and he had inherited a lot of properties from his family, but they were encumbered with problems, and it's one of the people that he was dealing with on their major manor home in the country and acreage that referred him to the prison. He'd borrowed money for this person, and he didn't pay it back, and so he is referred to the Fleet Prison for debt. This wasn't an uncommon circumstance that befell a lot of significant people. And actually, his Arthur Golding's biographer questions, as successful as he was with selling his translations, and the family came with money, and he inherited wealth and property, but he still had serious money problems. He had serious problems with cash flow. And he is now in this time frame of 1592 to 1593, and we don't know exactly when, but it is exactly, but this is the time frame. He is referred, and I use the word referred because he is not incarcerated inside the prison. Debtors were not put in the prison, inside the prison where the common felons were. They were allowed to live, and he would certainly have been allowed to live because he was a gentleman, and he was a person of good status as a scholar. He had very good scholarly, good status for his accomplishments. They were allowed to live in an area that was adjacent to the Fleet Prison that was called the Liberties of the Fleet. And what's amazing about this is they could come and go to do work so they could pay off their debt. They were allowed to come and go as needed. They had freedom of movement when they were living at the Liberties of the Fleet. And the interesting thing about this is I looked at a map, and I've done this in the past week, to see where are the Liberties of the Fleet located next compared to Blackfriars, because we know that Richard Field's printing house, where Venus and Adonis was printed, is in the Blackfriars. And the two neighborhoods are right smack next to each other. Arthur Golding was living right there within, at the most, a few city blocks of where the printing house was, where as Venus and Adonis either are before or during the time Venus and Adonis is underway going through the printing process. He is the perfect person with the right qualifications, the skill set. He's at the right place. He's at the right time to be the one to manage the process of getting through this phenomenal poem based on his own work through the printing press, to be the masterpiece that it is, and to receive the great adoration from the public that it's going to receive, because it's, as we've already said, it's going to be a sensational thing when it meets the general public.
And written by his sister's son.
Exactly.
Yeah, and when you talk about him having money problems, then we look at Edward's issues with his frivolity and spendthriftiness, and you go, okay, well, apparently the Golding side of the family had some issues with money.
Actually, money issues weren't unusual in the upper classes or the lower classes. And if you look at the people who were sent to the Fleet Prison to pay off debts and work, this is not an unusual thing to happen. Too bad, but it happened all the time. John Donne, who was soon to be the Dean of St. Paul's, had a stint probably in the Liberties of the Fleet. I doubt that he was actually incarcerated there, but he was sent there for debt. So it's a long list of distinguished people who had this problem, and it's not unique to Oxford. It's not unique to his uncle. But it's so nice for us because we can actually, with documentation, we know that he was right by exactly where he needed to be at the right place and at the right time to do this very significant job on behalf of his nephew.
Now, do you think that they had any idea at the time? Like, so, from an artist's perspective, not every show I have directed or every show I have performed in has been my best show. Not every show can even be better than the last show. You make every show as good as it can be. And when that one's done, you move on to the next one. I have like my top 5 or my top 10 that I can look back in my career and say, those were the best ones. But you do tend to know when you've got a hit on your hands. You do tend to have a feeling of, oh, this is a good show. This is going to be a good piece. This is going to be so well received by an audience. Do you think he had a clue at that time that Venus and Adonis was going to be so successful? Or was he just hoping it would at least be mildly successful to accomplish its goal?
That is a wonderful question. And of course, it's hard to know. But I do think that the principles involved in this thing, whoever, they say, we're printing it, Arthur Golding, I think, is there to be supervising it. Oxford, he had some sense that this thing was going to fly. It was a lot to ask of a poem, but it was going to really be magnificently successful. And what we have on our hands here is what I would call Operation Honourable Discharge. With the thanks of this poem, the slate is cleared for the two young people to go their separate ways. Ultimately, both young people will marry to their heart's content. Elizabeth will become the Countess of Derby. Southampton will marry for love, too. And Oxford will get to enjoy the sensational acceptance from the general public for his work.
So much so that he follows it up the very next year with another smash hit. Not quite as successful, but pretty close.
Pretty close, yes. At this point, he's taken the crowd by storm. He must feel that his life's work and all the suffering that he's put in to become a writer and to do what he's doing has certainly paid off.
So one of the things that I love about this timeline that we've just gone through here, and with pointing out the extreme importance of this first publication to show the name William Shakespeare in print, is it also can help inform us on the origins of the name. And if we look at it as the name was first created for this publication specifically, this poem, and not to be a playwright's name, but to be a poet's name, it tends to make far more sense that he would choose the symbolism in the name and in the words that exist with regards to homage to poets. Poets being willies who carry the willow branch, and that slang terminology and the whole idea of will I am a will, I am a willie, I am a poet. Because, obviously he's a very clever man, and he must have sat and thought about it for quite some time as to what name he was going to create and invent to put on this piece, this first piece that was going to go out into the public view.
I totally agree with you. I want to point out to your listeners that I think he, as you say, he had thought about it, and a lot of thought went into it. Way back, about 15 years before the publication of Venus and Adonis, he is on a progress with Elizabeth, and it's a very famous progress that we have a lot of documentation about. And what would happen is the scholars, the people that would greet them, would write tributes to Elizabeth and how wonderful the Virgin Queen and how great she was, and the courtiers, and he's one of the courtiers. And the tribute to him has incorporated into it this amazing thought or statement. The person writes, and it's Gabriel Harvey writes, of our guy, Oxford, "Thine eyes flash fires, thy countenance Shakespeare's." And I suggest that was a seminal moment. Either from that point whether that's what jogged in his mind, that if I ever have to go public with something I'm doing, that would be a right nice name for me to put forth to the public. It's a seminal moment, almost like, and I'll use a parallel to the more contemporary times. We all know that there was a young man in the Civil War who was fighting. His name was Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and he was fighting away at a battle in the Civil War. And another general was saying, "There goes Jackson, standing like a stone wall. I want all of you to do that." And that from that time forward, he was always called Stonewall Jackson. The
Right,
moniker
right.
stuck. And so when Gabriel Harvey said, "Thine eyes flash fires, thy countenance Shakespeare's," that either he had been flirting with the idea about that time, or it was suggested by Gabriel Harvey that this would be a very appropriate and very fitting name for him to have. And so if he ever needed a nom de plume, that would be a very good one. And the William is important too. You've stated that very well. And so here he is. He's going to go public with one of his works. And as he begins with the dedication to Southampton, he writes, "I know not how I will offend in dedication," because he doesn't know if it's going to be successful. This whole thing is quite a show to get on the road. It's been authorized by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it's going to be supervised through the printing by his very scholarly uncle. But he doesn't know if it's really going to fly. He says, "I know not how I will offend in dedicating my unpolished lines to your lordship, or how the world will censure me." Could he be censured by it? Well, of course, why would the young fella from Stratford be worried about that? He's to be a great feller. But our guy, this is a very big undertaking that is risky. It's a risky business. Lord Burleigh might change his mind. Something might happen with with the daughters in her situation or Southampton, and basically it all worked out. It's uncanny that everything came
But you're
together.
right. I think those first few lines of the dedication answer my question, and that he didn't know that it was going to be such a hit. I mean, he obviously was pleased with it himself, and he obviously felt that it was a great work, or he wouldn't have put it to this purpose. But he did. It does seem like he had some insecurity about how the multitude would respond. And it must have been such a tremendously pleasant surprise to watch it become the smash that it became, and the demand for more copies leading to, 8 subsequent additional versions being published. That's quite a feat in itself.
Yes, how the world, he could have hoped for that, but it probably exceeded his greatest hopes at the time. And he
that
does
certainly
feel,
would be empowering.
oh gosh, yes. But he was certainly tentative in that dedication.
Yeah.
And you can tell the year later that when the second dedication, if you compare that one, the one of Venus and Adonis, to the second dedication to Lucrece, at this point, he's a much happier camper. He knows he's got a hit. He knows that this thing is, as you said, it's been a bestseller. It's a smash. And he's so much more, the love I dedicate to your lordship, he says, is without end. And he's just clearly overjoyed with the success of his earlier work, and he's anticipating at this point, he has some reason to think his second follow-up poem, Lucrece, is going to meet with good success too. And it does.
Absolutely. And right. And so it's less apologetic.
Exactly.
The second dedication, the first dedication almost begins with an apology. And that's not uncommon of this writer. When you look at, for instance, the final speech from Puck at the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the octameter that is there, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended." It's an apology at the end of the play. Subsequently, a listener recently sent me some notes and some questions and asked about the Duke Vincenzio in Measure for Measure uses octameter at the end of Act 3, Scene 2 of that play, which is pretty much, it's the end of Act 3. It's where, as a director, is where you would normally put your intermission. So at the end of the first half of the play, you have the Duke delivering octameter, and it's also sort of apologetic in its excusing of the tactics he's about to use against Angelo. And in the conversation I had with this listener, I theorized, and I'm going to now go back and look through the canon to find the other instances of octameter in the canon, because I'm starting to feel like when the author uses octameter for a character, he's sending a very specific message to a very specific member of the audience of one, the queen herself.
Well, the queen is definitely around and about this thing, because she would not have allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was her main clergyman, and he is probably the reason that he authorizes Venus and Adonis and takes this massive and unusual step is probably to do it on behalf of the Queen, because the Queen is saying, "Okay, I'm going to be okay with all of this." And when the marriage, by the way, I love what you were saying about your about the play, and that sounds like a wonderful line of investigation to go through. These things always open up more things for us to think about and explore.
Every time, yes.
Yes. But I might point out, and I don't know if you know this, that it has been thought through the centuries that the Midsummer Night's Dream was first performed at the marriage of Elizabeth Vere when she finally marries William Stanley, who she loves, and becomes the Countess of Derby. I don't know did you know that?
Yes. Okay. I'm aware that is what that is one of the strongest positions, I believe. And I definitely believe that I believe that a great number of the plays in the canon were first performed as court dramas and for a select audience of only the nobility and courtiers. And that's why I say many of the plays, I believe, were written for an audience of one. They were written first for her, and then he knew who else would be in the room. And so there are also specific jokes about and for certain other people who he knows are going to be sitting there watching. I think in some cases he takes jabs at certain people that he knows the Queen will laugh at, and that brings him some joy to cause her to snicker at someone else's expense, because of course he had his own enemies, plenty of them, in fact. So that's my belief on how many of these works first came to be. But I do think that this new aspect of looking at this poem, the very first work out there, is interesting. And it also now brings me to the question, as you mentioned, the Queen would not have allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury to endorse the work. Did she read it first? Did she know how much it depicts her? Or did she love the fact that she knew she was being compared to Venus, the goddess of love? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do, and I can't really go to answer that question. It's an interesting thing to contemplate, but because she was often compared to goddesses and different of these heroic and various and sundry, they were constantly flattering her, and somehow, so who knows whether she actually read it or not, but she knew the situation, because when Elizabeth Vere finally marries the Earl of Derby, when William Stanley finally becomes the Earl of Derby and the marriage is set, she has the marriage festivities. She has a marriage performed at Greenwich Palace, which is her favorite palace, and she's there in to see it. So for the Queen to attend
obviously supported
the wedding,
marriage. Yeah.
She's obviously supporting this particular marriage. And she didn't often support marriages. She didn't really like for her, they call it her maids of honor and the different people around her to get married. But she's supporting this one, which is all really kind of amazing. So it all worked out. And but why would it really strongly supports that Oxford is Shakespeare. In so many ways, so many threads come together when you know this story.
Absolutely. And it's just another very rich layer to this beautiful work, and now opens the door to more exploration into the work and into finding particular lines in the poem that support these positions and these connections as well. And so now I can't wait to go back and read the poem with this in mind and see what might jump out at me off the page now that I have this different lens to look through. And that's something that I always say to our listeners is that's the number one goal of this series, is for listeners to hear a conversation like the one we just had, open up their minds to a different lens, and then go back and reread the works and see what speaks to you. See what you find in there that you believe is a clue or another breadcrumb on the trail to solving this magnificent mystery.
That's wonderful. Hear, hear.
And I want to thank you, Bonner, so much for joining us again for what has been another incredible episode of the program. It's always a delight to have you here. And I know we could just go on and on about other topics, and I'm sure in the future we will. But we are at the end of this episode. And once again, our great pleasure of having back, ladies and gentlemen, Bonner Miller Cutting. Remember, she is also the author of Necessary Mischief, and you can get a copy of that book if you don't already have it at any of your book purveyors, Amazon or other. And I encourage you to pick that one up because you'll find some incredible information in there. And you'll also, if you look back at our past episodes, you'll find past episodes that feature Bonner, including one where we talk about some of the contents of her book. So if you want a little teaser about the book, you can go back and listen to that episode and sort of sample before you buy.
Thank you so much.
What are you working on next, Bonner?
Well, my hope is to get this particular article, actually to get it written, and I will appreciate any comments and feedback that your listeners have. They can send it to you, and then I know you will relay it to me, and I will very happily respond because I want to get this written up and supported with the academic materials that I have, and I will be very happy to see what your listeners think. Thank you again for letting me do this.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to reach out, please, you know how to do that. It is contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Or you can reach us through the Dragon Wagon Radio website. You can go to dragonwagonradio.com where you'll find all of our back episodes, and as well as you'll find several other podcast series that you might be interested in. If you haven't checked out the network, you should. We're a proud member of that network, and we have lots of colleagues there who have their own very interesting podcasts. Make sure you check that out if you haven't. So please send your comments and your feedback, and I will forward them on to Bonner. And when she says she will respond, she means it. She always does. She's very accessible that way. So please feel free to reach out. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Thank you again, Bonner, for joining us. Thank you, loyal Quillers, for inviting us into your space, whatever that space might be, wherever you listen to us from. We're so glad to have you as our loyal Quiller Nation. And remember, until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.